Are you a businesswoman who is finding it challenging to get your ideas across and make a point? Welcome to Speakers Who Get Results with Elizabeth Bachman, a podcast dedicated to helping women get the visibility they want, whether making a speech or talking in a meeting. Every week, get valuable lessons from Elizabeth or learn from her roundtable conversations with experts and speakers on how to make a difference, not just a point. On to the show with your host, Elizabeth Bachman.
Hello, and welcome to Speakers Who Get Results. I'm Elizabeth Bachman, your host, and this is the podcast where we talk about presentation skills, leadership, communication, also gender equity, visibility, and diversity, and especially my personal favorite, the nuances of language and how that applies in a global workplace. Speakers Who Get Results is about communication for leaders. And yes, we talk about how do you deliver your speech? How do you write your speech? How do you get booked as a speaker? But we also talk about communication within an organization. How do you lead your team? And how can you be heard and show up as a leader? I launched this podcast in December of 2019, and I'm recording this in December of 2024, exactly 5 years later. And it's time to finish. We're going on hiatus for a while, maybe forever. So for my last episode, I wanted to tell you a bit about how my thinking has evolved over the last 5 years, how this podcast has been part of it, and where my thought leadership is today. I started this podcast to provide information and strategies to my clients. 8 out of 10 of the high-level executive women that I speak with tell me that although they may have a seat at the table, they're still not being listened to. And so they see promotions and recognition go to louder, flashier people. They're frustrated. They're hitting the glass ceiling. Actually, usually that's about when one of their friends says, go talk to Elizabeth, because I hear this over and over and over when somebody comes to talk to me. So I started this podcast to get more information, not just from my brain, but from many, many experts who could share insights, and I could learn from other very smart people for the sake of those who aren't being heard and who need some help. I'm incredibly grateful to all the experts who've joined us, and just check out their website. You'll see all their names. Even especially proud that this is an international podcast. Although most of my listeners are in the US, about 2/3 are in the US, a good 30% or more are listening from around the world. People like Mei Lin in Vietnam, or Brigitte in Sweden. Anton in Germany contacted me from Heidelberg the other day. Jorge in Barcelona also had said he'd listened to my podcast. Because I've lived an international life since I was 17 years old, I'm very proud of that. I work very hard to make that happen. Most of the comments are along the line of what Janet in Silicon Valley said. She said, I listen to their podcast faithfully every time it comes out because I know there's going to be something interesting, a good conversation, and at the end, there will be something concrete that I can implement. I'm very proud of that. Over the course of the last 5 years, one of the most common questions I get is, how can I get them to listen to me? And one of the things that I've realized is that being seen in a leader is how you show up, executive presence, you could call it, how you speak, but also how you communicate with the people around you. which of course is what I spent 30 years in the international opera business doing, helping opera singers show up as leaders. And it turns out the difference between corporations and opera companies isn't all that big. It's really just vocabulary. So just show up as a leader. Easy, right? Lots and lots of people talk about this. But what I realized is there's a fundamental breakdown in communication that most people don't talk about. I mean, it's so common that we take it for granted. And it's one of the major causes of unhappiness and frustration and irritation in the workplace. I call it lost in translation, and it's the topic that I speak on the most, whether in a keynote address or on a podcast or in a workshop. What I call it is, lost in translation is about, on one hand, we know now that statistics tell us that organizations that have diverse voices, especially in leadership, have better profits, greater ROI. There's lots and lots of statistical proof for that. But when those diverse voices aren't listened to, especially the women, they get fed up and they quit in frustration. So here you have an organization that's spent a lot of time and money bringing great women in and then not listening to them, and then they walk away, which of course is expensive for the person who quits, obviously, but it's also very expensive for the organization. Turnover is expensive. When you lose somebody good, not only do you lose their expertise, their institutional knowledge, the projects that they're working on slow down because they don't have that person at the head of it. And then you have to hire a recruiter, which is also expensive. So this is a cost that doesn't have to happen. I think it's an old pattern. It doesn't have to be that way once we realize what's going on. So think for a minute. Have you ever heard a woman say, "Ugh, men, they never listen"? Or have you heard a man say, "Women, they go on and on and on and they never get to the point"? Both things are true. I think the problem is we're using the same words, but we're speaking different languages. This has historically been called men's language and women's language, but it's really not that binary, especially in the last 20 years or so. The differences have been devolved. It's more of a spectrum than a binary. But for the sake of clarity, let's call it single focus thinkers and multi-focus thinkers. So you have the single focus thinkers who are historically men, traditionally men, but not always. And you have the multi-focus thinkers who are historically women, traditionally women, but not always. Single focus thinkers are task oriented. They're the ones who do one thing at a time and don't try to interrupt them because they won't hear you. And that's great because that's how things get done. The multi-focus thinkers, on the other hand, are the ones who can keep 5 things going in their head at once. And they see the world in a web of relationships. So they're the ones who are going to notice the side issues, such as, hey, before we spend all this money making this fancy new app, has anybody actually asked the client if they want it? That's a direct quote from one of my clients, by the way. The problem comes for the single focus thinkers is that they can get into tunnel vision. And the multi-focus thinkers, if they think as a web of relationship, they're trying to talk to the single focus thinkers. Single focus thinker is focused, is not listening. The multi-focus thinker tends to think that it's a personal rejection. This happens all the time. It's very common. If you recognize that there are actually two languages going on, then you won't expect to understand each other, because you need the single focused and the multi-focused working together to have a good team. So if you actually recognize that the other person is hearing something else, or you say you think you know what you've said, but they didn't understand you, then you can adapt. I like to think of it as if the single focus speakers speak Spanish and the multi-focus thinkers speak Italian. And if you're going to speak Italian to a Spaniard, they're going to understand the basics of what you have to say because the languages are very similar. But for anything important, you've got to get a translator. And this is the lost in translation problem that causes so much irritation. Because frankly, if someone's speaking a language you don't understand, it's easy to just tune them out. We're so used to it that we take it for granted that men don't listen and women never get to the point. And again, this is a highly simplified version of a very nuanced subject. But what if it didn't have to be that way? What if those smart women didn't have to quit because they could speak to their colleagues in a language that the others understood? And what if the single focus thinkers realized why their multi-focus colleagues were unhappy, paid attention, acknowledged them, and gave them the full focus? Then we would be able to communicate with each other. It's possible. I've seen it happen over and over again. This is the heart of what I do. When you solve this problem, you can be a speaker, a leader, and a communicator who gets results. Exactly how to solve the problem depends on who you are. So if this resonates with you, please contact me. There are many ways to tackle this problem, and I can talk to you at that point. So as we wind up this podcast, I must thank the brilliant, wonderful experts who have been guests and who've shared their knowledge with us. Their insights have broadened my knowledge in ways I never imagined. Thank you, listeners and watchers, for joining me on this journey. You can still subscribe, leave a review, share this podcast with your friends. It's 5 years worth of content, so it'll take you a while to get through it all. It's been an honor to be the host of this podcast. Whether you've been with me since the beginning or this is your first episode, I'm so grateful for your time and attention. This is Elizabeth Bachman, signing off.
We have just concluded another great episode of Speakers Who Get Results with your host, Elizabeth Bachman. If you got value from today's episode, please feel free to share us with your friends and colleagues. You may also visit elizabethbachman.com for additional resources. Be sure to tune in every week for new episodes, and thanks for tuning in.